The city was never kind to Sarah. At just 19, she found herself without a home, wandering the cold streets, hidden from the world's view. Her only possessions were a few worn-out clothes and a small tattered blanket she'd managed to find in a dumpster. The world felt indifferent to her pain, and survival became her only focus. One fateful evening, as Sarah was crossing a quiet street, she heard a loud screeching noise followed by a crash. Her heart skipped a beat. Without thinking, she rushed toward the sound, her instincts kicking in. In the middle of the road, a luxury car was upside down, smoke billowing from the broken engine. The man inside, slumped and unconscious, looked like someone from a world far beyond hers. Without hesitation, Sarah yanked open the door and pulled the man out, her strength driven by sheer adrenaline. His face was pale, his clothes expensive, but he was clearly in pain. She knew she couldn't leave him there. He could die. "Please, hold on," she whispered, trying to keep him awake. She managed to drag him to a nearby alley where she found shelter. There was no one else around, no help to be had. Sarah knew she couldn't call the authorities. She would be questioned, and that would only lead to more trouble. So she did what she could. She cleaned his wounds with the little water she had, trying to keep him stable. Hours passed and he finally stirred, his eyes flickering open. At first he seemed confused, then scared. His gaze landed on Sarah, who was sitting nearby, her clothes ragged, her hands trembling. Who are you?" he asked, his voice weak. "I'm Sarah," she said quietly, trying to sound calm. "You were in an accident. I helped you." He looked at her for a long moment, trying to piece everything together. I don't remember anything," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "Where are we?" "Just a place to rest," she replied softly. She didn't offer more details. There was no need. He wasn't important to her. He was just another person who would forget her once he was better. But something about his presence felt different. There was a certain calm in his demeanor, despite his disheveled state. His eyes held a depth that made Sarah uneasy, as if he knew more about her situation than he let on. The next morning, Sarah awoke to find the man still lying there, but now more alert. He was staring at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment she froze, unsure if he would remember anything or if he was just a stranger who had wandered into her life for a brief moment. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She had no real reason to care, but something in his eyes made her feel like she should. I think so," he said, his voice hoarse. "But where am I? How did I end up here?" Sarah hesitated before replying. She didn't want to get too involved, didn't want to offer more than what was necessary. "Just a place I found," she said simply, not wanting to give away too much. She shifted her weight, looking away. "It was a bad accident. You should rest." The man nodded, but his eyes never left her. There was something strangely familiar about him, like a memory lingering just out of reach. He pushed himself up slowly, wincing as pain shot through his body. His fingers brushed against his wallet, which had fallen out of his pocket during the crash. Without thinking, Sarah picked it up and handed it to him. He looked at her, his gaze sharp. "You didn't take anything from it, did you?" His voice was a mix of suspicion and gratitude. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I would never." He studied her for a long moment, then opened the wallet. As he flipped through the contents, Sarah's eyes widened. She had caught a glimpse of something, a name, a business card, his true identity. The name on the card was one she recognized instantly, Alexander Wright, the same name that had been splashed across the headlines for months, a CEO of one of the largest corporations in the country, one of the wealthiest men alive. But why was he here, lying in an alley with her? For a moment, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had heard rumors about Alexander Wright. His name was known far and wide. His wealth, his success, his ruthless business practices. The rich, untouchable man who was always surrounded by security and luxury. And yet here he was, helpless and vulnerable in a filthy alley. But she couldn't let herself get distracted. She had enough problems of her own. She couldn't afford to get caught up in someone else's world. She looked away, trying to push the thoughts out of her mind. I need to get back home," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. "But I don't know how to get there." Sarah blinked. You don't have a phone? He shook his head, grimacing. It was lost in the crash, and I don't have much cash on me. Without thinking, Sarah offered, I can help you find a way back. She regretted the words the moment they left her mouth. Why was she offering him help? What was it about this man that made her act against her better judgment? Over the next few days, Sarah and Alexander formed an unlikely and awkward partnership. She guided him through the city, using her knowledge of hidden shortcuts and underground routes to help him avoid attention. Despite his status, Alexander had no idea how to navigate the city's grittier streets, and Sarah, in her own quiet way, became his guide. She led him to a small diner where they could sit in peace. The place was far from glamorous, but Sarah liked it that way, simple and unnoticed. As they sat in a corner booth, Alexander stared at the menu, clearly uncomfortable in his surroundings. He didn't belong here, not among the grease-stained tables and the worn-out chairs. It wasn't just the environment that made him stand out, it was his very presence. Even here, in the simplest of settings, he was a man used to command, used to getting what he wanted. Can I ask you something? Sarah broke the silence, her voice calm. Anything, Alexander replied, his eyes meeting hers. There was a strange trust in his gaze, something that made her wonder if he saw her as more than just a passerby. Why were you driving alone, she asked. Someone like you should have a driver, bodyguards, anything. You're famous. His lips twitched into a small, almost imperceptible smile. I don't like being followed, he said simply. Sometimes, I just want to be normal, be left alone. Sarah wasn't sure if she believed him, but she didn't press. Everyone had their reasons for wanting solitude, she supposed. Maybe his life was more complicated than she imagined. As they ate, Alexander's phone buzzed, messages piling up on the screen. He glanced at it but didn't respond. Sarah watched him closely, sensing the weight of the decisions pressing on him. It was clear that his world wasn't as simple as hers. There were forces pulling at him from every direction, expectations that he could never escape. What's the matter, she asked quietly, her voice filled with a mix of curiosity and concern. Alexander sighed, leaning back in his chair. I'm being watched, and he said, by my business partners, by people who want something from me. They won't stop until they get it. Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew what it was like to feel trapped, to have no way out. She had nothing in common with this man, yet the sadness in his voice resonated with her. They were both just trying to survive, to make it through another day. But what troubled her even more was the growing realization that Alexander was hiding something. There was more to his story than what he was letting on. The way his eyes shifted when certain topics came up, the vague answers he gave. It all felt like a mask he was carefully maintaining. And then, as if on cue, a man in a sharp suit entered the diner. His gaze scanned the room, landing directly on their booth. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The man was looking straight at Alexander. Without a word, Alexander stood up quickly, pulling Sarah along with him. We need to go, he said urgently, his voice low but firm. The man in the suit was already moving toward them. Sarah felt a surge of panic as Alexander's grip tightened around her arm, pulling her toward the door. She didn't understand what was happening, but the fear in his eyes told her it was something serious. She tried to keep up, her legs unsteady as she followed him through the crowded diner, her mind racing with questions. Who was that man? Why was Alexander so scared? They burst out into the cold street, the harsh wind cutting through the air as Alexander scanned the surroundings. He looked both ways, his eyes frantic. Sarah's heart raced in her chest, the adrenaline of the chase mixing with confusion. Stay close, he ordered, his voice low but urgent. Who was that? Sarah whispered, glancing over her shoulder. Someone I owe money to, he said shortly, not giving her any further explanation. Now is not the time to ask. They continued down the street, weaving through the crowd, Alexander clearly more at ease in the chaos of the city. He knew how to move swiftly, how to avoid being tracked. But Sarah wasn't used to this life. She was out of her element, her survival instincts suddenly kicking in. She had learned to stay invisible, but this felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of danger that hung over them both. After what felt like an eternity of running and dodging alleyways, they finally reached a building. a small, nondescript apartment complex. Alexander led her through the back entrance where a worn-out elevator awaited. He pressed the button for the top floor, his movements quick and deliberate. The silence between them was thick, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder what kind of life Alexander had been living. She had seen the glitzy side of his world in the papers. Lavish parties, high-profile meetings, luxury. But this was a far cry from the image the world had of him. The elevator doors opened, and they stepped into a dimly lit hallway. Without a word, Alexander took out a key and unlocked the door to a modest apartment. It was clean, simple, but there was nothing about it that screamed wealth. It was the kind of place someone might go to escape the world, to hide from everything. Once inside, Alexander turned to Sarah, his face serious. "This is where you'll stay for the night," he said, his tone softening slightly. "It's safe here, for now." Sarah looked around the room, unsure of how to feel. Part of her wanted to run, to get away from this complicated mess she had somehow found herself in. But another part, a deeper part, was drawn to the mystery of this man. There was something about him, something she couldn't ignore. "You don't have to do this," Alexander continued, his voice quiet. I don't expect anything from you, but I owe you my life, and I won't forget that." Sarah met his gaze, unsure of how to respond. She had never been in a situation like this before, never been shown this kind of kindness by someone who could have easily ignored her. But she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a simple debt. Alexander Wright, the man she had saved, had secrets, and she was determined to uncover them. The following days were a blur for Sarah. She stayed in Alexander's apartment, trying to keep to herself, but the tension between them was palpable. Alexander kept his distance, though there was an undeniable shift in the way he looked at her, like he was seeing her for the first time, not as a stranger, but as someone who had altered the course of his life. One evening after dinner, Alexander sat across from her, his eyes deep in thought. He looked like he had a million things on his mind, but couldn't find the words to say them. Sarah, on the other hand, was still wrestling with the reality of the situation. She had saved him from death, and in return, he had offered her a place to stay. But something didn't feel right. His secrets, his guarded emotions, they lingered in the air, thick and heavy. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Sarah asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. The question had been gnawing at her for days, and now it was out. "Why did you hide everything from me?" Alexander's gaze flickered, but he didn't look surprised. Instead, he seemed resigned, as if he had been expecting this question all along. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "It's complicated," he said, his voice distant. "I didn't want to put you in danger. My world, it's not a safe place. People want to use me, to manipulate me. If anyone found out I was here, they'd use you to get to me." Sarah's heart clenched as she listened. She had heard rumors about Alexander's life, how his business dealings were ruthless, how his wealth had been built on the backs of others. But hearing him speak like this, so vulnerable, made her see him in a different light. He wasn't just some cold, heartless CEO. He was a man trapped in a world he couldn't escape. "But why me?" she asked, more to herself than to him. "Why did you choose to trust me?" Alexander looked at her, his eyes searching hers for a moment. "Because you're the only one who hasn't wanted anything from me," he said quietly. "In a world where everyone has an agenda, you've been real." The words hit her harder than she expected. Real. It was the one thing Sarah had struggled to be her whole life. She had lived in the shadows, hidden from the world, trying to survive on her own. But in that moment, Alexander saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. Not as a homeless girl, not as a charity case, but as someone with value. Her heart beat faster, a mix of emotions flooding her chest. She didn't know how to respond to his kindness, to his honesty. It wasn't something she had ever experienced before, and yet something in her told her that this moment was the beginning of something far bigger than either of them could anticipate. But just as quickly as the moment of connection appeared, the reality of Alexander's world crashed back into the room. The doorbell rang, sharp and demanding, cutting through the silence. "Don't answer it," Alexander said, his voice cold again. He stood up quickly, his expression hardening. It's them. Sarah didn't need any explanation. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on them. She stayed still, watching as Alexander's face twisted with determination. He wasn't the man she had first met, on the street, weak and vulnerable. Now he was the man everyone feared. He moved swiftly toward the door, his hand gripping the handle. But before he could open it, he turned back to Sarah, his eyes locking with hers. Stay here. Don't come out, no matter what happens, he warned, his voice low but urgent. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, her thoughts spinning. She didn't know what she was getting herself into, but she knew one thing for sure. Alexander Wright was not who he appeared to be, and his secrets were about to change everything. The door creaked open, and Sarah could hear the deep voices of two men talking outside. Alexander's posture was tense, but his face was a mask of calm, something he had clearly mastered over the years. Sarah stayed where she was, her breath held in her chest, waiting for something to give, to reveal the truth behind Alexander's sudden transformation. Mr. Wright, one of the men said, his voice rough. We need to talk. I told you, I'm done. Alexander's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. There's nothing left for you to take. The tension in the hallway was almost unbearable, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she strained to hear every word. The man outside scoffed. You think you can just walk away from this? The second voice asked, sneering. The sound of footsteps moving away from the door reached Sarah's ears, but Alexander didn't relax. He remained standing, his back to the door, eyes closed, as though bracing for a storm. He had made enemies, and now those enemies had come to claim what was theirs. Suddenly, the door burst open, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped. The two men stepped inside without warning, their eyes scanning the room with cold precision. Alexander didn't flinch. He didn't even look at them. He just stared ahead, as if accepting his fate. What do you want? Alexander's voice was barely a whisper, but there was no fear in it, only a cold, steely determination. One of the men stepped forward, his hands in his pockets. We want what's ours, right? You've been hiding for too long. The deal's off. You're not getting out of this. Sarah felt a wave of panic rise inside her. This was more than she had expected, more than she could handle. These men didn't just want money. They wanted something far more dangerous. But then, in a flash of movement, Alexander turned, and with a speed that shocked her, he grabbed the man by the collar, pulling him close. You think I'm the one who's been hiding? Alexander's voice was low, dangerous. You have no idea what I've been through, and you won't control me anymore. The man's eyes widened as Alexander shoved him back against the wall. There was a moment of silence, the air thick with tension. Sarah's heart raced. She wanted to intervene, to stop whatever was happening, but she knew she was powerless in this world of danger and shadows. This wasn't her fight. Finally, the men turned and left, their footsteps echoing down the hallway. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. Alexander stood there, breathing heavily, his face pale but resolute. He had fought back, but at what cost? He had shown a side of himself Sarah hadn't seen before, someone capable of ruthlessness and power. But even in his victory, she could see the weariness in his eyes. He walked over to her, his expression softening. I'm sorry, he said quietly. You didn't deserve any of this. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to process everything she had just witnessed. Who are you, really? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. You're not just a businessman. You're something else, something dangerous. Alexander's eyes darkened, but his voice was steady. I did things I'm not proud of to get where I am, but I'm done. I've made mistakes, and now I have to live with the consequences. Sarah couldn't help but feel sympathy for him. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it was like to be trapped by the past, to be defined by the choices you made, even when you wanted to escape them. He stepped closer, his gaze intense. I owe you everything, Sarah. You changed my life, but I need to ask you something. Will you help me? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Alexander wasn't asking for a simple favor. He was asking for trust. Trust that Sarah hadn't given to anyone in years. But in that moment, as their eyes locked, something shifted. Something deep and unspoken passed between them. Sarah realized that she was no longer just a homeless girl. She was part of his story now, part of a tangled web that neither of them could escape. And maybe, just maybe, that was the only way they could find redemption together. With a quiet nod, Sarah stepped forward. "I'll help you," she said, her voice strong despite the fear that still lingered in her chest. And in that moment, they both knew their lives would never be the same.